Hey everybody, it's Ian King, founder of King Sports International, athlete advocate, coach educator, innovator of training methods that have changed the way the world trains. In this video, we're going to be looking at the story behind the theory. And these are the theories that are contained in the Legacy 2nd edition, Volume 1, 2, and 3. During the last 45 years, I've had a lot of opportunities to gain experiences, and these experiences have shaped my conclusions about how to train and develop theories. And this is what this series is all about. So let's get stuck into it. Theory number 3, what is the best way to train? When I set out in 1980, it was a fairly selfish goal. I simply wanted to know what the best way to train was for myself. In fact, it had been a question I'd been seeking answers to since I was first introduced to what I call dryland training back in the 1960s. And I'd realised that I wanted to know more about how to train, but very few people knew the answers. So setting out in 1980, my first year of undergraduate study, I was hopeful that they would have the answers there at university. That aside, since my formal entry into the profession in 1980, the single pursuit has been around the question, what is the best way to train? And what you'll see in some of the references that are included in the Legacy 2nd edition Volume 1 book under this theory, what is the best way to train, is a list of some of those spanning decades where I've explained to people that my purpose has been to find the answer to the question, what is the best way to train? Initially for myself, but then over time for the athletes. And it didn't take long before they put pressure on me to find the answers for them. So going through some of those references, starting with, I've spent my entire coaching career seeking answer to the question, what is the best way to train as it relates to athletes? As you go through, you can see the consistent explanation that I set out at uni. Picking the courses I did was fairly self-centered. See, I had to learn how to find the answers all through intuition, trial and error, watching the responses, reading all the literature that I could find. When I realised that the university course didn't hold all the answers, and that's no criticism, that's just reality. And that continued on. As you can see, I just kept sharing the same message over the years, explaining my purpose and what's guided me, and that is the answers to the question, what is the best way to train? 33 years ago, I set out with one question in mind, that was to answer this, what's the best way to train? When I was about 7 years old, for whatever reason, there was an Indigenous fellow who's in, and he was a local strongman. Now, I don't know how that happens, where in an island in the Pacific in the mid-1960s, you bump into the only strongman in the country. But that was my first exposure, and I always remember him flexing his biceps, and I putting my little arms around his probably little biceps then, but they looked very big to me those days. And watching him do handstands around the local pool, impressing all the Marys, as we say in Papua New Guinea, for females. So that was my first exposure to the strongman. And when I went to high school, before I went to high school, he took me down to the local YMCA in Port Moresby, where I was brought up. But that didn't last long because I worked out I was only 7 years old and they kicked me out pretty quickly. When I went to high school, I thought this would be great. I've got exposure to a gymnasium. The high school and boarding school in Australia was a demountable World War II building. It had a wooden floor, no floor covering, there were holes in the floor. The barbells were concrete in jam tins with steel bars in between them. That was literally the gym. And I worked out pretty quickly that no one knew what they were doing. Everyone made an effort, but really no one knew what they were doing. So I'd come to Australia at the age of 12 to learn how to train, but no one knew. The closest I got to it was a group of Chinese boys at the time, and this is before Bruce Lee popularised Kung Fu, at least in Australia. We weren't allowed to know what it was. It was secret Chinese boys' business, and they used to go off and quietly do their martial art training. And at night time, they used to do push-ups, sit-ups, and before the sunset, there was parallel bars out in the outdoor area where they used to go and do a set of dips. So from when I was 12 years on, I was out there imitating them. We're doing a set of dips before bed, before the sunset, and then before bed, push-ups, sit-ups. And I continued that right throughout my high schooling. But training was still pretty primitive in those days. It was pretty much you carried the bricks around the golf course sort of stuff. No one really knew. So I thought, this is great. I'm going to go to university because they'll know what to do. So I went to, my first year at uni was 1980. And I pretty quickly realised that no one at uni really knew what to do either. You know, I was considered a bit of a weirdo because I was interested in strength training. And I was the only one in my department who was interested. In fact, the closest professor to the area of strength training took me aside one day and said, Ian, I've got these magazines. I don't really want them. I know you'll be the only one in the department to be interested in them, so have them. And they were NSCA magazines from the 1980 and 1981. And the Association of America had only begun in 1978. So that was my earliest exposure. I came to America in 1989 for the first time, and I've been back 50 times since. through and out. I've sometimes come in and back to Australia, sometimes go through to Europe, etc. And I've seen a lot of changes in America, which we can talk about at some stage. But the bottom line for me is that, with the exception of a period of about 2 years during my undergraduate time where I was a gym instructor at the YMCA in Brisbane, I've never really been involved in the fitness industry. I was servicing athletes before the word personal training was created. So I really don't know anything about personal training per se, and I'm not involved in the fitness industry. The question I've sought to answer right throughout my life is, what is the best way to train? Now, some people seek to be famous, some people seek to dominate. I just seek the best way to train. So my question was this: what is the best way to train? Now, I didn't come up with the idea that static stretching is good because I read about it from someone else. I developed my own approach to static stretching, for example. I developed all my work is original work, because I had the opportunity to work with literally thousands of athletes, in some cases up to 100 per year in the same squad, up to 10 years in a row. There are 3 or 4 squads that I trained 10 years continuously. Now, nobody in the world gets that sort of exposure across sports. Squash, rugby, skiing, so many sports have had continuity of an average of 10 years. You really need a minimum of 20 years with an athlete to see performance, and you need 40 to see impact on longevity. And the full human lifespan is 80 years. So I've been studying this stuff in the real world for 31 years now, and I was just starting to learn some really good stuff because I said 40 years. So for me, the question is, what's the best way to train? And I had no influences whatsoever. Now for you, it's different. You've come in possibly in the information era. So let's go through this. 1980, I started coaching, and I started writing about it extensively in 1998. So 18 years later, and I started my Get Buff range 19 years after I started coaching. So there's a fair bit of water under the bridge before I started doing that. But the information age considered to commence in 1989, so by then you've been inundated. And I feel sorry for anybody who's come into the industry, in particular post-2000, because what I teach is what I've come to my own conclusions about based on trial and error with athletes. What you'll probably do is what's successfully marketed to you. 33 years ago, I set out with one question in mind. That was to answer this: what's the best way to train? When I went to university, when I decided to go to university in 1979, I went there for one reason: to understand how to train. What's the best way to train? And 33 years later, I've got a lot of answers, but I'm continually looking. But the answers only come when you have the question. And I find that people are not asking the right questions. They're not asking the best questions to get the best answers. Many questions start with, but don't you think? But what if? Rather than a more open question. Now, I mastered the art of play pretty well. And all kids on an island without TV do. But I didn't know how to train. So I realised there was something missing. I wanted to know how to train the formal component of training. Because when you combine play with a little bit of formality, you get a sporting outcome which is pretty desirable. I've spent my entire adult life, or actually since I was a kid and my adult life, pursuing answers to the question, what is the best way to train? So my affinity for the athlete is I want them to have the answers and what is the best way to train.